Now, from the Democratic Alliance, there's Shadow Minister of Finance, Dion George. Dion, good afternoon to you. Your first reaction to the budget, how do you feel about it?
Well, we certainly did like the narrative that the Minister was offering to us. If you look back on the State of the Nation address, the President said that it's business that's going to create the jobs because government can't, and we know that. So he did say the right things, but I don't think that he walked in the right direction. I don't think that he put the money where the President's mouth is. And I think that the biggest problem that he has is the political space that he's moving in is quite limited. So what we would have liked to have seen him do is to tackle head-on the public sector wage bill. Instead, it's increasing by 20 billion rand. It is not affordable, and that's the key driver of the debt crisis, because we're going to pay about 1 trillion rand in interest on debt over the next 3 years. It's simply not affordable. And if he doesn't tackle that elephant in the room, we're not going to get anywhere. So that, we thought, was something that he missed opportunity. I think that's because of the space that he's operating in. Also, he was quite tepid on the state-owned enterprises. He said nothing about the new, what would you call it, the Uber state-owned enterprise that's going to be looking after all the other state-owned enterprises that are basically bankrupt. So he never said anything about that, although he did say he's going to cut money to them, and we thought that was a step in the right direction. On the corporate tax, that's great. That was already factored in by the markets, and that is a step in the right direction. What he also should have done, in our view, is that he should have looked much more closely at how you actually drive growth in the economy. So, for example, we need to attract investment capital, and we need to encourage domestic saving. He didn't do much in terms of attracting more capital. Obviously, cutting the corporate tax rate does mean that there's technically more money available for investment in the economy. But if there's not enough sentiment, business will not invest. So we need to create that environment that's more conducive, better regulation or less regulation. We also would like to have seen specific incentives for small, medium and micro enterprises. For example, tax holidays, tax cuts, or no tax at all, and also possibly tax even for employees of smaller business, because then it makes it less expensive for the business to operate. It can then grow, generate money for the fisc, and then we have a virtuous cycle working. So we would have liked to have seen that. We also would like to have seen some incentives for saving, because there's barriers to saving in South Africa. South Africans do save, but there's tax that gets in the way. So, for example, the tax-free savings account, the threshold for that could be increased per year, and also the threshold for paying tax on interest earned could also be increased. Also, there could be relief, for example, on tax on rental income. So there's lots of microeconomic interventions he could also have done at relatively low cost, but he didn't do that. What we did also like is that he's talking more about infrastructure. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. You talk specifically about taking on the unions in the public sector. But
yes,
for any government anywhere, even with our arrangement of the tripartite alliance, this is always very difficult. You're talking about nurses who've been working very hard during a pandemic. Many of them will have seen their colleagues lose their lives during a pandemic. You'll have seen teachers. Many of them have been teaching literally twice as many classes because of the way the classrooms have been run. This is really the right way to say to nurses and teachers, this is really the right moment to say, we're going to cut your salaries or we're going to stop increases?
No, that is not what we're saying. We are saying that those people in the private sector who are already overpaid, and the millionaire managers who are not...
Public sector, you
adding, sorry, public sector, yes, who are not adding sufficient value, they are the ones that we need to cut. We are not saying we're going to cut the front line. So, for example, your policemen and your teachers and your nurses, no. In fact, what we're saying is we need to put more money on educators, for example, bring retired educators into the system, because that's what we need. If you properly educate a very young and dynamic population, then you have the growth you want. So no, we're certainly not saying to those people that your salary should be cut. No. What we are saying is that when you look at the way that the public sector is configured, if you look at the amount of management there, you have people who are deployed into that sector who are not adding value but are earning a huge amount of money. That is what you need to cut. And that is where huge amounts of monies can actually be saved. In fact, we were fairly conservative in a 60 billion rand saving that could be achieved.
One of the places that is going to get more money is the police.
Yes.
And I mean, there was a cut last year. I'm not going to say that the violence we saw last year was a direct result of that, but we know that cutting money to the police is, generally speaking, a bad idea, especially in a country with a growing population, especially in a country where from, I think, 2018 it is, we've seen the murder rate start to climb quite dramatically. Do you welcome more money going to the police?
Yes, absolutely. We've been saying for a very long time that the police are undercapacitated. We need to have more police stations, and we need to have more people on the ground. So yes, we certainly support that. That is an expenditure that is necessary. We also believe that you need to spend on infrastructure, as I said before, specifically on water infrastructure. The Minister didn't speak much about water. We've been talking about energy, for example, for quite a long time. Injecting the private sector in there is a very good idea. But there's not much happening in terms of the water, and that's the next big crisis that's coming our way as well. So absolutely, where spending is needed, it needs to be done. But where we need to cut back on spending, that needs to be quite aggressively done.
The Ministry of Justice is getting just over 1.1 billion rand. Now, that's basically the NPA's budget. I mean, it's not just the NPA's budget. We know the NPA said it's under-resourced. We know also that there have been suggestions from various places that the private sector could maybe make donations to the NPA, make donations to a fund to the NPA. As a Democratic Alliance, should the private sector be involved in the criminal justice system?
Well, they shouldn't interfere in the criminal justice system, that is for sure. But I think where it is possible to have a public-private partnership, for example, to inject more money into the system in the right places, I think that there's a place for that. So, for example, I think there's a large degree of political interference that happens in the system, which is not a good idea. Also, the lack of political will has hamstrung, I think, the authorities to get where they need to go. For example, I asked the Minister in my first, when I was back in Parliament, asked the Minister how many people have been put into jail for corruption. He said, well, I don't do the prosecutions. No, he doesn't. But how many people have been put into jail? Probably nobody. So that's the problem. I think the system is working reasonably well. It does need more money, and it will get more money, and we would support that. But there actually needs to be political will to get people held to account for what they are doing. We did, as you saw, propose a corruption tax, for example, that would be levied on business that found guilty of committing corruption, because it's a two-way street. It's not only that we find in the public sector, it's also the private sector aiding and abetting government corruption. And that needs to be stopped, because we need to have positive sentiment in our economy.
For the first time in years, for the first time in about 3 or 4 finance ministers, there hasn't been an increase in the fuel levy. And the petrol price is becoming a real issue now in our economy, but also for people just trying to get by. Anyone who uses a minibus taxi to get to and from work, to get the kids to school, is going to be suffering because of the high petrol price at the moment. The Minister Enoch Godongwana was sitting in that chair about an hour ago now. He said he's speaking to the Minister of Energy, Gwede. They're talking about having a proper look at the fuel price formula, which goes back many years to before democracy. Is it the right time to have a proper look at that? Are there any changes you would recommend?
I think it's a very good time to do that, and we would support that. In our alternative budget, we proposed that the fuel levy should be cut, because, as you know, the fuel levy is driving inflation very heavily, because as your fuel price increases, as you mentioned, it costs more to get transported wherever you're going. It costs more to transport goods around, and that makes everything more expensive and starts to crowd out other things that people could spend on. So we would be very pleased if something could happen there, because it is overpriced. There's too much administrative pricing in there.
Do you know what you would take out? So the fuel, so all the money goes to something. Yes. 6 cents a litre goes to pay the petrol attendant. You can't take that out. Some money goes to the person who runs the petrol station. Well, maybe we can take some of that out. Some of it goes to the road accident fund.
Yes.
You would need to fund the road accident fund another way, and there's a huge amount of debt in the road accident fund. I'm not going to make a comment on accounting practice, but there are major problems there.
Yes, the reason why it's like that is because it's been grossly mismanaged. So what you need to start doing is to get that road accident fund to operate properly. If you put some proper principles in place, you wouldn't get to the place where you're at. We are in that place now. But also, if you look, for example, at the private insurance sector, I don't know what is possible, but we certainly need to have some creative solutions. So there's no reason why you can't apply your mind to how better insure that industry. So I think there's a lot of space for thought on that. But we definitely do need to have a lower fuel price. We do need to cut administration costs in that pricing.
There's no spending, there's no basic income grant. We knew that the President had already told us that, but there's a lot of talk coming, there's an election coming. I remember when Tony Leon was the leader of the Democratic Alliance, if I remember correctly, the DA was in favour of a basic income grant then. Are you still?
We still are, yes, indeed. The only reason why we haven't made it a bigger feature in our alternate budget is because it's always been very difficult to price. So, for example, how do you actually pay for it? This year, we did, in fact, put 105 billion rand aside to roll over 3 years to introduce a conditional basic income grant. Just a small start, because what we do believe, if we look at the modelling, if our economy can grow and we can get more revenue into the fisc, you can actually get the space. If you are prudent in your spending, you can actually get the space to fund a basic income grant. Not only over the next 3 years, but on a longer term basis. But you would have to be counter-cyclical. So what you'd have to agree, you'd have to discuss it with the social partners. It would have to be understood and agreed that when there is no money to pay for the grant, where are you going to get it from? You can't tax anymore. So we can't fund the grant from tax. We have to fund the grant from revenue. And the only way you can get the revenues to grow the economy, and the only way you can grow the economy is to incentivize people to invest in it, both locally and internationally, and also to encourage domestic saving. If you can get that virtuous cycle going, you can get more money, and then also, as your economy grows, fewer people need support because more people are getting into jobs. So if you can get the virtuous cycle working, that can actually work. The problem we have now is the cycle's going the wrong way. Government is spending too much. It's got too much debt. So it's running out of space to provide services, at the same time running out of space to provide incentives, and at the same time running out of space to actually support people who desperately need it, because there must be support. There's no other way. There's no way that we cannot support people who are in a desperate situation. That we cannot have.
Dion George, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. The Shadow Minister of Finance for the Democratic Alliance here.